It does? Yeah, a little bit. I thought I might be having a stroke also. I'm so tired at this point in the semester. I'm just like, please kill me. Like, maybe it is a gas leak. I'm assuming they would tell us if something was wrong and not just let us all die, but that might be giving the university more credit than it deserves. At least most people didn't show up today, so most of the class will be spared. Yeah, the final exam will be conducted, who knows how, without me and you. How's the test? You've all done it? Okay. Yeah. Straightforward. Okay, good. I just spent the entire morning recording lectures for another class. So I'm increasingly of the opinion that all classes in the spring should be online because I just feel like students like them better. But whatever, let's jump in. It's not fun for me because staring there talking to myself actually is quite similar to me standing here talking to 4 people. But there you go. Okay, so obviously more people will be here on Wednesday. It's just people didn't want to come for an hour and a half. I understand. I've set up a weird situation where I don't want to penalize you with like extra time that you have to spend on a day, but it makes a disincentive to come for that hour and a half class on a Wednesday or on a Monday. Okay, so we're going to talk religion today. So we're going to talk about what's going on with youth and religion. I want to change colors. I'm tired of red. I was recording lectures all day, Saturday and Sunday, and my pen always switches back to red. So we're going to go with green, happier color. Okay, so we're going to talk youth and religion, and once again, we're going to be talking a little bit. We're going to set up some basics of religious landscape, just talk a very tiny bit about what the religious composition of our millennial and Gen Z cohorts are. And then we're going to go and look at some research, first on the millennials and sort of their relationship to religion. And then we're going to talk, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the millennials. I'll explain why in a sec. And then we're going to jump to Gen Z and talk about what they're like religiously, because I think it's an interesting story. Okay. So when we talk about, religious composition, what does each generation look like religiously? And this is all data from the US. Canadian data looks a tiny bit different with I can talk about it a little bit. I don't have it visualized quite as well. But what do our generational cohorts look like? So if we go back to our silence, right, we had the vast majority, 50, well, these are the ones still alive, right? So the vast majority of our silence would consider themselves Christians, right? They are either Protestants or Roman Catholics, 60%, right? And this is down a little bit historically, but that's still where they are. The boomers, right, a little bit down, but still pretty overwhelmingly Christian. 59% say that they are either Protestant or Catholic. Gen X, I'm going to never stop getting these two mixed up. Gen X, right, we're talking still above 50%, half, just above half, say that they are, either Protestant or Catholic, so Christian. The really interesting kind of dip comes with the millennials. Not a big shift in terms of Catholics. Catholics are pretty stable across the board, but the share that say they're Protestant, dips for both millennials and Gen Z into minority territory, right? And it's only with, a little bit of rescuing from the growing cohort of other world religions that Christianity remains sort of the dominant, being religious remains dominant. Okay, so the really big change, aside from this massive decline in Protestantism, is the growth of this category, right? The brown, is that brown? My daughter says I'm colorblind. What color is that? Yellowy brown? I don't know. I thought like that green car. You mean the teal one? Yeah, green. Anyway, apparently men can see fewer colors than women. Okay, so the growth of this category, right? The silence, 13% of them saying that their religious identity is nothing in particular. When we get up to millennials and Gen Z, we're talking about a share of somewhere in the range of nearly 30%, right? Just over a quarter, just under 30% saying they are nothing in particular. And then, you add atheist, agnostic, which you can't see because I chose a green pen. My circling doesn't really show. You have a solid, almost 45% in that category. So, or in those categories of what we might call no religion. Or infamously, what gets referred to a lot in popular discourse as these are the nones, right? In terms of religious identity. Now, Canada's story is a little bit different. And like I said, I don't have a great visualization for it. But when we talk about millennials and Gen Z in Canada, their rate of identifying as nones is about somewhere between 36 and 44%, depending on the data source that you are using. So nearly half of Canadian millennials and Gen Z are going to identify as non-religious, more as you head, west of the Quebec border, with BC topping out at, I think, about 55% of British Columbians who are millennials or Gen Z saying that they have no religious affiliation. Oh, that's just Telegram, not important. Okay, so our share of Americans with no religious affiliation in total, right, basically kind of hovering at close to a third of Americans from 2020 to 2023, according to information from Pew National Public Opinion Reference Survey. So somewhere around, a third, we're going to say about a third of Americans consider themselves nothing in particular. And that's pretty close with Canada. On the last census in Canada, the number was 34.6% of the total population. And this is a number that's grown exponentially since the 1970s, right, in Canada. So this Canada in 1972, why can't I rate dates ever? 1972, it was 4% who consider themselves non-religious. In the US, in the 1970s, it was about 5%. And today in both countries, it's over a third, or it's around a third, right? Okay. So now I will say these are concentrated quite extensively, as you see here, in these like 3 youngest generational cohorts. All right. All right. So that wasn't the flavor I was expecting. I forgot I made that kind of tea. So basically, share with no religious affiliation, and this is by birth year, has been pretty stable now, or is pretty stable kind of for our millennial and Gen Zs, right? This is our start of the millennial cohort is right here, and Gen Z. It has risen a little bit, right? So someone who, all right, so and these are different, sorry, I should explain what's on here. Let me do that. So these are different years of data from a survey called the Comparative Election Survey, which surveys about 15,000 Americans every single year on a variety of things. And so basically, the way Ryan's broken this down on this chart is he's broken it down kind of by birth year, right? So the birth year is your bottom sorry, the birth year is this axis, right? And the percentage who consider themselves non-religious is the other axis. Bless you. You're my class sneezer for this term. It's just every class. Okay, so what do we see? There's not a ton of, so these are millennials over here, right? Gen Z is going to start right around here. And this is, our youngest cohort of Gen Z that we sort of have in data sets because they're the ones kind of, now available to be surveyed. So what do we see? Well, these are 4 different years of data, 2020, 2021, 2022. But basically, what it looks like is our millennials and our Gen Z are about the same in terms of their kind of likelihood to be nuns. Gen Zers, younger Gen Zers are slightly more likely than millennials to consider themselves nuns, but it's not a ton, right? So these 2 generations are very similar religiously, which is really, really interesting because every generation before that, from the Silents, the Boomers, Gen X, and then Millennials, had big religious differences, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to flash back, as you can kind of see on this chart. But Millennials and Gen Z are quite similar, right? Even on those kind of, even all of these numbers, right? The religious composition of Millennials and Gen Z looks relatively the same, right? A 3% difference here, 1% here, 2% here, 1% here, 1% here, and the same, right? And that's a kind of interesting quirk of social science data because we sort of expected from what was going on, right, and in this, that, probably this number would continue to rise and that Gen Z would be far less religious than millennials were. But the kind of loss of religion amongst Gen Z seems to have kind of slowed to a crawl, right? It's maybe still increasing, but really, really slowly. Okay, so we follow the line, right? The share of Americans with no religion, and that's the really interesting story, is the rise of no religion has been kind of inexorable right up until here, where it's kind of slowed down and dipped. But you see how sharp that upward line has been. That's really unusual, but there's some evidence that that has kind of slowed. All right. I know these charts are hard to read. There's some evidence that kind of in terms of Gen Z, we're not seeing a lot of year-to-year changes in the way that they're sorry, stumbling over my words. We don't see a lot of year-to-year change in terms of the religious composition of Gen Z. So this is data taken from Springtide Research Institute. So I'll write Springtide. And they're a research institute in the US based out of Colorado that does every year research on young people, right, 13 to 25, and specifically focused on religion. And they've been doing this since about 2018. But I've got the 3 most recent kind of bits of data because every year they publish a report, which I dutifully pay for. And then I pull out this little chart that they publish every year on the religious composition of kind of young people. And what you see is that the identification of Gen Zers is pretty stable, right? So in 2021, 22% said they were just Christian, 19% in 2023, and then 26% in 2024. So there's a little bit of wobbling in the sample, but it's kind of within a range, right? A kind of high of 26 and a low of 19. But then other numbers, right? Protestant, 16, 19 here, 11 here. It's kind of a weird low for Protestant there. Catholic doesn't really change that much. Catholics are 16, 16, 18. So not a big wobble. And sorry, I could probably explain something here, but, and then, sorry, nothing in particulars. Where are they? In orange here. red here and orange there, right? Again, kind of wobbling within a range, but there's sort of some movement around in, non-atheist agnostic, none and atheist agnostic, but it's all kind of within the same range. And if you add it up, in all of these samples, it's just a little bit over 55%, or over 50% of young people who are some kind of Christian, and then, about I think a quarter in this sample that are, atheist agnostic or nothing in particular. So in this, data set collected by this one group, over a 3-year period, what we see is a pretty stable picture of religion with some kind of differences in identification, but overall kind of, it looks like Gen Z has kind of stabilized. We're not seeing like big drops in religiosity year on year like we were seeing with millennials when they were about the same age. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay, so we're going to talk here about the millennials, because probably one of the more interesting stories of religion of the 21st century was some of the big changes that millennials went through in terms of religious identity. And we have a ton of religion data on millennials when they were young, owing to one of my favorite studies of all time, the National Study of Youth and Religion, which I talked to you about at the beginning of the course when we were talking about some of the data that we have on millennials. National Study of Youth and Religion, ran from 2001 till 2015 in 4 waves. And just last year, the last book published off the data, what they said was going to be the final book published off of the data, a book called Back Pocket God, which I haven't quite gotten to yet, was published, right? And so it's a really rich research study that basically, do I have the numbers here? Did, at the beginning, just over 3,000 surveys with teens and their parents, and about 300 in-depth qualitative interviews, and then followed those people subsequently at 5-year intervals with follow-up surveys. Now, by the time that they got to wave 4, they'd lost about 1,000 people. Either they died or they'd lost track of them. They couldn't reach them because people move around and contact information is hard to keep up, over a 14-year period. But they still managed to pull together a good data set over this kind of period. Okay, so we're going to focus on kind of their first, just talking about religious identity in the teens and emerging adult years. We're going to focus on the first kind of 2 waves of the data. So the one from 2000, that was kind of 2001, 2002, and then 2006, 2007, when they revisited the same group a couple of years later as they were kind of working through their emerging adult years. Okay, so the first big publication out of this study, and the one we're going to talk about first, was a book called Soul Searching: The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers. And it made the very provocative claim, and one that people, are still repeating and still citing and still quoting, that the, actual, right, de facto and really lived religion of most American youth was not, Christianity, but something they called moralistic therapeutic deism. Okay, oh, and I will say, this is a study led by this guy, Christian Smith, at University of Notre Dame. I think he was at UNC Chapel Hill when he started the study, but then moved over to Notre Dame. Okay, and then his various coterie of grad students through the years. All right, so moralistic therapeutic deism. I'm going to play a clip, and I'll let Chris explain it to you, assuming the audio works in this room.
The majority of American teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not Presbyterian, not Jewish. The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, I say in the book, is something like a combination of a divine butler and cosmic therapist. He takes care of your problems, he helps you to work out your difficulties, and doesn't get too personally involved in the meanwhile. Moralistic therapeutic deism basically believes, sure, a God exists, it's theistic, God created the world, God orders the world morally, people should be nice and fair and friendly, that the purpose of life is to be happy, to be satisfied, that's what it's really about, that God doesn't need to be very involved in one's life, God can sort of be off at a distance, hence the deism, except when one gets into trouble or has problems or needs something solved, then one can call on God and God will sort of hop to it. And teens have an immense amount of faith that God solves their problems. He fixes their troubles and he makes life work better. He makes them happier. Religious traditions are, from my perspective, are really being colonized and corroded from the inside out by moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is, as a sociologist, I am skeptical of what is going to be the fiber or the theological content or the intellectual substance of beliefs and practices of people a generation hence. It seems to me that many social forces are basically converging to sort of watered down religious faith of all different sorts, so that you no longer have distinctively Catholic and Jewish and Muslim and Wesleyan or whatever. You just have this sort of bland mush of be nice, call on God when you need him. And that is not what these religious traditions really believe. I've come to think that in our culture, increasingly, the language of faith is like a second language. It's like Spanish or French or German. It's not a primary language that people learn and speak. And we know about second languages that you don't just pick it up by osmosis. You need to be around people that speak it. You need to be instructed in it. You need to have practice talking in it. And I think one of the things that was clear in what we found is that very few adolescents are having much practice learning to speak their second language of faith.
who aren't here. Oh no. I'm sorry, my microphone turned off. Oopsie. I turned it off to play the video and then forgot to turn it back on. Okay, syncretism. I will answer your questions. I'm really sorry, I meant to check that. Gold without shimmer. Okay. I will figure out a way to get you that material. I have it somewhere else. I will post a link to it. And we'll pick it up from here. So, the word I wrote was syncretism. Syncretism is, mixing religions. I'm sorry I turned the mic off. I thought I had turned it back on. Okay, we'll pick it up from here, and for those who aren't here, I will send you a link to last semester's lecture, where I did the same lecture. So, all good. All right. This is the sort of key thing of how moralistic therapeutic deism works. Because as Smith and Denton suggest, it's not a religious system in and of itself, right? It's too thin, right? Its creed is way too thin at the end of the day. So it's not a system that's adopted or not, but it's actually one, they describe it as parasitic. So this kind of ideological system has sort of latched onto other religious systems and transformed them from the inside out, right? So it's sort of changed them over time into a version of itself. So what Smith and Denton suggest is where you used to have really distinctive, religious traditions in the United States, Catholicism, different forms of Protestantism, evangelicalism, and so on and so forth. They've all sort of been, infected by moralistic therapeutic deism, which sort of dissolves them from the inside out and breaks down their distinctive characteristics into, and you heard it in the clip, into a kind of non-distinct religious mush, right? That basically all these religions end up being kind of the same. They might have some minor distinct characteristics, right? They would retain kind of a surface veneer of Judaism, Catholicism, Islam, Mormonism, or whatever. But on the inside, their beliefs are slowly being transformed into, no, don't play again, into this, right? Into these kind of 5 beliefs. Okay. Oops. Okay. So, most teenagers in the US, they think at the time they're writing, are not really, say, Christian or Jewish or anything. They would be, Christian moralistic therapeutic deists, or Mormon, or even non-religious moralistic therapeutic deists, right? Because the whole kind of moral and religious system in the US has been infected by this parasite, this parasitic set of ideas that's transforming religion from the inside out, and turning it into a version of itself. Okay, so these, a significant part of this tradition would only be tenuously connected to actual historical religious traditions, right? And it's pretty inexorable. It does it to essentially all religious traditions. Okay. I say okay too much. I also, apparently, according to my wife, I also sigh too much. It's just deep breathing. All right, so Kenda Cressy-Dean. So Kenda Cressy-Dean was also a researcher on this project. So she is a Presbyterian youth minister, if I recall, and a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. It's part of Princeton University. They have a Presbyterian seminary there. That's where they train clergy, and she's one of those. But she was a researcher on the project. She did a lot of the in-person interviews in the state of New Jersey, where Princeton is located. So she got access to the data, and she wrote this book. It's called Almost Christian in 2010. Really interesting book, but very specifically, I just want to focus on one little part of it. And that is her take on why moralistic therapeutic deism has emerged, right? Why it has become such a central part of the American religious landscape. And what she suggests is that the reason it has emerged is because for American religion, it basically served an adaptive purpose, right? It allowed American religion to adapt to new social circumstances. Um, so, this is a quote from the book. One person told me, moralistic therapeutic deism is one way the church survives in American society by equipping people to be happy enough, right? So it turns religion into a therapeutic kind of project that allows, people who adhere to religion to be just happy enough to kind of get along. And it turns, God, I guess it approaches God instrumentally. It turns God into a tool, right? A tool in the toolbox of personal happiness. Okay. So, an invisible tool that allows or that empowers us to do good and feel good, and makes sense in a pluralistic consumer culture. Okay, one more thing about it from her that I want to focus on, but I need more space, so I'm going to erase this part. So, this little quote here, I like it. So, she says that for religion, social survival requires, and I wish I could come up with phrases this good. I feel like my writing is always kind of drab compared to this. Turning down the heat on Jesus, and other confessional particularities, right? While highlighting personal and communal benefits that make anxious people feel safe and valued. But what is turning down the heat on Jesus and other confessional particularities? So this I take as a reflection of the fact that America, particularly for the millennials, becomes much more pluralistic, right? Millennials, and this is true for Gen Z as well, they're the most ethnically, racially, sexually diverse generations on record, right? Millennials were the most diverse until Gen Z comes along, and then Gen Z is even more diverse. So why then do you need to turn down the heat on Jesus? Well, the more pluralistic society you live in, the less likely you are to live in a society, in a kind of an environment of high social solidarity, right? Where you share a lot of the same beliefs, morals, values with everybody that's living around you. If you went back to, say, let's say the 1950s, chances are that you lived in communities that were all white, or, all the minority that you were, Black or Asian, probably all shared the same religious beliefs, right? You were all Catholic or Protestant. Probably, like, I think going back to like the 1960s, in Canada, it was like 92% of Canadians were either Roman Catholic or some branch of Protestant. So, it's very unified. And so you could kind of dial up the energy on religion and some of those, confessional particularities. As you get more pluralistic, you're likely to know and be friends with people from all sorts of backgrounds, non-religious, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and all of these things. And one of the things that's going to make living in that society really difficult is if you're always trying to convert each other to each other's religions, right? So the kind of, late modern tolerance in pluralism sort of requires you to be like, we all kind of believe the same things. So there's no point in trying to convert each other. There's no point in arguing over religion, because whether you're kind of Muslim or Catholic, right, you all believe the same things. And she tells a really interesting anecdote in the book, right, about her daughter. And she was driving her daughter and her daughter's friend to a soccer game, right? And they're sitting in the back seat of her SUV, and they're having a conversation about religion. And her daughter's friend happens to be Hindu. And so, they're talking about each of their religious beliefs, her daughter being a Protestant, right? Her daughter's friend being Hindu. And they come to the conclusion, and she's just listening from the front seat, and they come to the conclusion that, well, basically we believe the same things, right? Like, okay, I'm a Presbyterian, you're a Hindu, but basically, we believe the same things, and we all want, to be good people and all of that fun stuff. Now, why that's interesting is because there could scarcely be two more different religious systems than Christianity and Hinduism, right? They are vastly different. They have completely different histories. They don't really share any lineages. They have some basic philosophical underpinnings that you can find, like there's a deity that created the universe. But beyond that, they don't share a whole lot in common, right? They're completely different. And yet, in order to kind of get along with each other and make religion a non-issue, her daughter and her daughter's friend come to the conclusion that these two religions are basically the same, right? One believes in Jesus, one believes in Vishnu, but who cares? So that is a function, like that's a feature. I'm going to say it's a feature, not a bug, of MTD. Because what it allows her daughter and her daughter's friend to do is to get along, right? Without having to worry about converting each other, without being like, you're a godless heathen that's going to hell, so you better turn over your life to Jesus right away, and then, feel like you have to preach to people all the time. It's like, no, you're okay, I'm okay, we're all okay. So as society gets more pluralistic, religion sort of has to water itself down into this very basic set of beliefs so that everyone can just agree we all believe in the same thing at the end of the day, and we don't have to fight about it. Okay. Okay, can I explain a bit more on self-help being related to neoliberalism and capitalism? I mean, it's just a very capitalist ideology, right? It's an ideology that tends to stress maximizing your potential, right? Especially your economic potential, right? That achievement, especially achievement in terms of, position and, possessions and money is the most important thing, so that you kind of, improving yourself in that direction is, one of the key goals of life, right? Doing your best all the time. Is MTD being, I don't think, so is MTD being a bad thing only for those who want to keep purity of religion, since there are adaptive benefits? I don't actually think, let's say from a kind of a just as objective as we can be, sociological perspective, I don't think we should use the language of it being a good or bad thing, right? It's definitely an evolution of kind of religious belief in an interesting direction, right? And I think it tells us something really, really interesting about the moral and kind of philosophical frameworks of the society that we live in, right? Where in order to survive, in order to help people get along better, religion has to kind of be watered down, right? It has to be broken apart, it has to be remade in this kind of very basic framework, rather than being kept very pure and very distinct, right? That's a kind of older way of thinking, one where there's more insiders, outsiders, but where you're all kind of mixed together, that stops making as much sense and is much, more efficient from a social perspective to find a way that we all get along, right? So if you all, if we can agree we all believe the same things, that's way more efficient than if we're all fighting over religion all the time, right? Okay. So I'm going to deep dive here a little bit into some kind of hard data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. So I have a lot of charts, and I apologize for the charts, but I want to illustrate a couple of points, and then, we'll talk about this, when people were in their adolescent years, then their emerging adult years. We'll kind of look at it again, and then we'll talk about Gen Z, probably next time. Okay, so one of the questions that, Smith and Denton asked, looking at the data from the National Study of Youth and Religion, was, does religion even matter, right? In terms of, being happy, well-adjusted, living a good life, is there even a difference between a young person who's religious and a young person who isn't? Because one of the things that they found in the qualitative interview data was that the young people they were talking to really didn't see much of a difference between those who were very religious and those who weren't, right? They didn't see religion as, and they struggled to see or to even imagine how their lives would be different if they were not religious, right? So the religious ones were like, oh yeah, I don't know. And most of my friends who are non-religious are still good people. So they struggled to really see how their lives would be different, um, if they weren't religious. And so Smith and Denton, using the data from National Study of Youth and Religion, asked this question, right? Is there an actual difference between, the most religious youth, the ones they call the devoted, and, youth of kind of lesser religious profiles, right? So the conclusion they came to, although many teenagers can't see it, according to the studies or the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion, the difference between more and less religious teens in the US are actually significant and consistent across every outcome measure examined. And what outcome measures did they examine? Well, they looked at risk behavior, quality of family and adult relationships, moral reasoning behavior, community participation, media consumption, sexual activity, and emotional well-being, right? All of this, right, because it's a huge sample size, they used multivariate regressions to control for 7 demographic factors. So things like teen gender, because they slightly oversampled young women, and young women tend to be, they tend to have a couple qualities that would, tend to lead to better life outcomes. They tend to be a little bit more religious. They tend to be more risk averse than young men, right, in general, which tends to lead to, fewer negative outcomes. Race, right? So, or sorry, I guess age, right? Because I think they slightly oversampled teenagers in the sample. Race, they balanced it out because they didn't have an exact mix of white and African American young people. Region of residence, they got a slightly bigger part of sample in the U.S. South, which is a little bit more religious. Parental marital status, we talked about marital status and parental marital status and its effects. Parental education and family income, to basically sort of balance the data so that, those things wouldn't ultimately skew the results. Okay, so they classed American young people into 4 categories. I think I took out the slide with the 4 categories. They have the devoted, I can't remember them now. The devoted, the regulars, the sporadics, and the disengaged by kind of measuring different things: beliefs, practices, experiences, affiliation, and group participation, right? And based on a bunch of, characteristics, they classed them into these 4 groups and then sort of looked at the outcomes for these 4 groups. Okay, oops, that slide shouldn't be there. This should be further ahead. Okay, so just going to look here at a few things just to illustrate some of the differences that you find in the data. Right, so when we look at, so here are our most religious, to our least religious young people. And all of these are sort of risk factors or risk behaviors that are behaviors that, generally speaking, would promote worse life outcomes if you undertake too many of them, right? Okay, so cigarette smoking, right? Because vapes weren't a thing in 2001. what we see is only 1% of the devoted said they smoked cigarettes at least once a day, and that moves up, where once you get to the religiously disengaged, you're talking about 14%. Alcohol consumption, right, weekly or more, right, the devoted didn't have any in the sample. The average for American youth was 5%. The disengaged were double that, right? A little bit more than double that. Have gotten drunk every few weeks or more in the prior year, 1%, and then it slides up, to 10% for the disengaged. Smoking marijuana, again, none of the devoted said they smoked it regularly. 93% said they had never smoked it versus 8% of the disengaged. And 63%, only 63% said they had never done it, which I guess is still 2/3. So that's good. I won't go through every single category here. I know you can read charts on your own. What you see is sort of consistent differences in risk behaviors across the board, right? With the devoted being the least likely to engage in risky behaviors, and the disengaged, and then the other categories, you kind of see it rising as they become less religious, right? Yeah, and I mean, I guess everyone thinks their teenager is bad-tempered, but there's still a meaningful difference. Now, some of these differences aren't very big, right? The difference between, say, 1%, I guess 1% and 13 is big, but 0% and 8% isn't a huge difference, but it's still a kind of difference. And all of these things, especially when you take them cumulatively, tends to lead to, kind of negative life outcomes. Binge drinking and other substance use in teenagers and emerging adults tend to be indicators, of things going wrong, right? Especially, when you're talking about marijuana use or, drinking alcohol weekly or more. Having tried it occasionally, not a big deal. Okay. This one I always kind of weirds me out because the difference is bigger than I ever would have suspected. Questions of body image and self-worth, right? So we look at feelings about your own body and physical appearance, very happy versus very unhappy. So 42% of American teenagers said they were very happy, and thankfully only 3% said they were very unhappy, which is good. But again, you see meaningful differences, kind of across the spectrum, with more of the religiously devoted saying they're very happy versus the disengaged, right? A fairly meaningful difference. It's not quite half of the disengaged, but definitely trending kind of there. Feeling sad or depressed, right? Again, a small gap, a 6% gap, but it's a gap nonetheless. Feeling alone or misunderstood, right? A lot. It's about double for the disengaged compared to the devoted, and on, right? Double again, though it's still a small number, thankfully. Feel cared for by the people responsible for the teen, 92 versus 73, that's a fairly meaningful difference. A lot versus, so that's a fairly meaningful difference. I'm surprised actually that the religiously devoted don't feel guilty about things in life fairly or very often. They must not be Catholic or Jewish, because guilt is sort of built into both of those. Think about plans for the future, right? Just across the board, right? You see differences in kind of body image and self-worth indicators, which is interesting, where, the devoted seem to have, a much more kind of positive outlook in general, which again, it's pretty consistent across all of these measures. And these are really kind of broad questions. They're not even questions about religion. Okay, relationships with adults. I'm going to come back to this chart later, because this chart is really interesting. And when we get to Gen Z and mental health, I'm going to draw, some points from this chart as well. But we see meaningful differences here, right? So, do they feel fairly or very comfortable talking to adults other than parents or relatives in terms of percentages? So 52% of American teenagers overall said they felt very comfortable talking to adults other than parents, right? It's 2/3 of the devoted, less than half of these two less religious groups, and the kind of those who are regularly engaged in religion but not super devoted to it, right, are kind of in the middle. Now, this is the one I really want to draw your attention, or these two are two that I really want to draw your attention to. So the number of adults a teen can turn to for support and advice, help, not including parents, and the number of supportive adults teens' parents know well enough to talk to. And what I think is really interesting here, right? So our national average is 5.7 and 4.6. In terms of, you could say, like caring adults in their lives that they're comfortable talking to, the devoted say that there are 8.4, right? And the rest are kind of, not too different, between 5.5 and 5, or 4.9, right? But let's just call it 5 for good measure, meaning that this, the devoted have considerably more caring adults. And the same thing, and this one's a big difference, number of supportive adults a teen's parents know well enough to talk to. So if your parents, want to find out what's going on in your life and you're a teenager, how many supportive adults can your parents know well enough to talk to? There's a big difference here. And again, we're talking more than double the number, 7.3. The rest of this is just change, right? They're a little bit less likely, or they have a few less afternoons per week spent without adult supervision, and a few less evenings per week spent without adult supervision. So they spend a little bit more time with adults than their peers. And I mean, this only matters in the sense of when teenagers are left alone, they often get up to trouble, right? Or, if we remember Gen X and what happened with Gen X, they were left alone, right? They were the latchkey kids and a whole bunch of them got pregnant. Because that's what happens when you leave teenagers alone too much in the afternoon and evening, is they invite people over and they, get into trouble. So slightly less likely here. Okay, I'll try to burn through this. I don't want to murder you with charts. And I have one more chart, and then I'll kind of tell you what the conclusions that Smith and Denton drew are, because I think they're really interesting. Okay, so they have slightly different moral reasoning and honesty behavior, right? And we talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the course, right? We talked about millennials in general being moral consequentialists, and that's kind of what you see in this chart here, right? They believe that morals are relative. There's no definite right or wrong, right? And, kind of for, I guess, our less religious part of the sample, it's around 60% who agree with that. For those who are religiously devoted, it's less than a quarter, a little bit more than a fifth. And about half of those who are somewhat engaged in religion, the regulars. Okay, if they're unsure about what's right or wrong, they would, in a particular situation, do whatever helps them get ahead. 1% versus 12, 13, 16%, right? So this is your moral consequentialism right here, and this is something else. If they're unsure about what's right or wrong in a particular situation, they do what would make them feel happy, right? Again, you see that those religiously devoted, they're just different. They think differently about moral questions, for good or for ill. They lied to their parents in the last year, right? Differences. Cheated on a test, very small difference, right? 6 versus 8%. It's basically, within margin of error. Did things they hoped their parents would never find out about, 7% versus, 22. So differences in kind of moral and reasoning behavior. All of what this leads to, according to Smith and Denton, is just, happier, more well-adjusted kids in that devoted category, right? And when we get to, next class, we'll talk about this next class. When we get to them in their emerging adult years, we'll see a kind of similar pattern in terms of the quality of their relationships with their parents, right? They're well-adjusted. They move into emerging adult life with a bit more ease than some of their peers. Okay, this slide, I've never been able to do this slide in less than 15 to 20 minutes because there's 9 things on this slide. Okay, so I will start and probably finish next time. Let me just check if there are questions before I go. Okay, no. So basically, what Smith and Denton say is that, okay, across all of these measures, the most religiously devoted teens seem to be doing better. They're adjusting to their adolescent years better. And then when we get to emerging adult, they're still doing better. And they say they think that this is down to what they call 9 cultural factors that affect emerging or teen and emerging adult life outcomes. And I want to note here that what Smith and Denton sort of say is that most of these are not particularly unique to religion. It's just that for whatever reason, religious communities seem to offer to young people more of these than non-religious communities, right? Than, those who are engaged in religion, right, are devoteds, are going to get more of this as a result of being in community than their non-religious peers. And really only arguably 2, maybe 3 of these are actually religious, right? So moral order definitely has a religious component here. Spiritual experiences, again, in this context does. And I would say maybe coping skills. So that one I kind of waffle on. The rest are not particularly, things that are unique to religion. They are things that are, deeply grounded in functioning and cohesive community life that religious young people seem to get more of because they are in these organic kind of communities. Okay, so I'm going to talk about each of these in turn and just kind of describe them to you until I run out of time in 8 minutes, and then we'll continue next time. Okay, so the first one is moral order, right? So what Smith and Denton suggest is that religion does a couple of things, right? So religion comes kind of, and it doesn't really matter what religion you're talking about, it comes kind of preloaded, right, with a moral code, right? So what does this do for teenagers, right? Well, this moral code is not established by people's desires or preferences. It also doesn't really require any thought. And if you've ever taken classes in criminology, right? I can't remember which criminological theory, I'd have to look it up. But, lots of these theories of how someone becomes deviant, one of the kind of key pathways to becoming deviant is having to make kind of ad hoc moral choices, right? Having to consider in any circumstance which action is correct or not. Having a kind of preset moral code will tend to be protective against kind of deviance, right? So if you have to think about it and sort of reason your way through in an ad hoc, in the moment kind of fashion, is the choice I'm making moral or not? You're at much greater risk of kind of being swayed by emotions. If you have a sort of preloaded moral system that tells you, inherently, stealing is wrong, cheating is wrong, whatever, whatever it happens, doing drugs is wrong, whatever it happens to be, and it's not established by people's own desires and preferences, it gives you a much simpler path to moral reasoning, right? You don't have to think it through. And think of some of the ways, again, I know I'm asking you to think back to the beginning of the course, even though it's non-cumulative, but some of the ways that millennials especially sort of found their moral reasoning, right? It was attending to their emotions, right? Morality is common sense. It's attending to your feeling. It's doing what feels right. There's a lot of gray area, according to Smith and Denton, for that to kind of go wrong, right? Where you will then do something deviant because it feels good or because you're not sure about the choice, right? And that's these two kind of categories, right? If you're unsure what to do what helps you get ahead. And if you're not sure what to do whatever makes you feel happy, right? These are sort of, I don't want to say questionable moral frameworks, but they're certainly things that are more subjective, right? Than, the kind of preloaded morality that you tend to find in a lot of religious systems. Okay, the other point here is that preloaded morality and in American religions tends to promote, moral directives of self-control and personal virtue, which are grounded in long historical and narrative traditions. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? These are the things that American society already values. So the kind of morals, that American religion often promotes, is the things that, have also sort of, I guess you want to say, co-evolved with American culture, so that those things are seen as virtuous, right? They're seen as ultimately good. And so people will see people who embody those things, right? These specific moral directives of self-control, personal virtue, as good, trustworthy, and helpful people, and they're more likely to help them, right? They're more likely to trust those people and therefore kind of help them get ahead in life, right? So religion just happens to, I guess because, we're kind of living in the shadow of a previously religious society, but a lot of the things that religion considered morally good are still things that we consider morally good today. And so people who embody that are going to be seen as good people more naturally, and therefore more trustworthy, better to hire, better to promote, all of that kind of stuff. All right, 3 minutes. What can I do in 3 minutes? I can do one more point, and we'll pick it up next time. So spiritual experiences, right? So religion is going to provide, obviously because it's religion, spiritual experiences that solidify the moral commitments and constructive life practices, right? So, if you're religiously devoted, you're going to have some kind of religious experiences, whatever it happens to be, right? It can be you're at a praise and worship concert and you feel the Spirit of God moving through you, or, some other ecstatic, effervescent religious experience that's going to then convince you that your moral commitments are correct, right? And so it solidifies those practices, making them even stronger, right? Making them even more likely to be repeated. So, it has this quality of kind of, self-reinforcing value in religion, that you have these experiences that then solidify the moral commitments that you already have. Okay, I can do one more. So, religious communities also are relatively good, based on this data, at providing role models, right? Positive examples of lives shaped by religion, right? And that's, if I go back to my numbers here, that's this number, right? That's that 8.4. Lots of role models, lots of adults that a young person can connect to that are hopefully going to be living positive lives shaped by religion, which again, further hardens that commitment they have and those moral directives, but also gives them a lot of adults that they can network with, that can support them, that can help give them advice, help them through hard times, direct them, be supportive of them. This is the sort of it takes a village to raise a child kind of view, in a sense. But there's more adults around these young people than those who aren't religiously devoted. And so those young people, and we'll talk about this when we talk about mental health, more caring adults is really important to things like good mental health, and feeling like you're doing well in life. So more role models, more caring adults that provide examples and can be supportive. Okay, I'm out of time. We'll do 4 to 9 on Wednesday. We'll keep going. We'll finish religion. We'll talk about crime, and then we'll be in the end times, the last days of the course. Okay, I'm out.
you.